Okay. So what's going on, YouTube? This is PNG Media News back at you with another segment. Today, we're going to be you in for a real treat. I have Dr. Patrick Bowen, and we're going to be going into the history of Islam in America. So, Dr. Bowen, um, can you introduce yourself to the people? Tell us who you are.
I am Patrick D. Bowen, independent scholar. I have a PhD in religion and social change, which is basically religious studies from University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology joint PhD program. I've been studying religious studies since an undergrad back in 1999 is when I started. And I've written a few books, um, mostly on conversion to Islam in the United States. I My main books are History of Conversion to Islam in the United States. It's a multi-volume series. Volume one covers white Americans up until 1975. Volume two covers Black Americans or African Americans up until 1975. Volume three is conversions of all ethnicities between 1975 and 2001, and that is forthcoming. In addition to writing my books and articles that are related to that, I write and research about history of religion in the United States more broadly, Christianity and Islam, and then I've also done work on um, American occult and esoteric traditions,
Mm,
which I got into because I was shown how those related to the history of Islam in the United States, and especially in its early years. So those are my main areas. I still work. I still put out new work, and but I am an independent scholar. This is all. I don't owe debts, or I am not beholden to anybody else. So I go with what I find in the evidence, and I
mm,
pursue that.
okay. So, how did you get into the study of religion, like as a major? Like, what made you want to go into that particular field of study?
I think that I've always been someone that believes in themselves
Mm,
and trusts that I'm making a good choice even when I make a wrong choice.
mm,
But I when I went to college, I was didn't know religious studies existed as a field, but I had always been interested in religion. I had studied it on my own. Uh, Even in high school, I would read books about religion, different religions, talk with people about it, and I always found it the most interesting subject in the world, always.
mm,
And I'm a spiritual person, religious person, and a lot of people in my family are too. So it was just a natural inclination. And even though it's not something I would recommend other people because it's not a safe field to secure a job,
mm,
if sometimes when you realize you have one life in this world and you want to do the one thing that you want to do, that's what you're going to do.
mm.
And there were times when I tried to not do it and spend several years doing other things. I was drawn back, and religious studies is to me a field worth dedicating all my time and energy towards.
Okay. Now, before we get into it, I want to ask you because I've come across some of your research, and I can tell it's like really, really in depth. So, what? So, when you approach this, like when you approach the study of Islam, like what was your methodology? Like, how did you actually begin your research?
Well, I didn't just come out knowing how to do all this.
Okay.
I had to learn from other people. And when I give people, tell them what I did, I advise them to seek out and learn from as many people as you can. That's part of the reason why I agreed to be on here, because I think people that come on your show that watch your show are seeking new information and about how to learn things for themselves. But uh, there's certain individuals, like if you start reading the literature, You can see people's names, the same people's names over and over, and you say, well, that person clearly knows what they're doing because everybody else is turning to that person.
Mm,
So one person in particular, Muhammad Al-Hari, is a Muslim researcher from Chicago. I reached out to him early on. He taught me a lot of how to research through library catalogs. Don't just look at other people's sources that they listed. Do it yourself. Get your hands dirty. Get into those library catalogs. Get into WorldCat. And when you go and do research on the internet, be as thorough as possible. Spell it in every different way. Put every different combination of thing on there. When you do, same thing when you do newspaper research and newspaper archives, look at every single way. And he and other people um, taught me that, you know, don't stop too. When you get tired, don't stop.
mm,
So for instance, people don't use microfilm. That's what they used to put newspapers on. They would take a photograph of the newspaper and put it on a little plastic film, and you would take it to the library. You go to the library, check it out, and then look at each page and you spin the wheel. And you can do that at some of the better libraries now, still to this day. But I probably have spent hundreds of hours looking at microfilm because those particular things are not digitized. Now, some people might say, well, I'm not going to bother because it's not digitized. I say bother. And when it comes to things that they're in a library, I'm from Colorado, so not a lot of history of Islam in the United States in Colorado. But if you speak to your librarian and say, look, I need help accessing these materials I found in these catalogs, say in New York or California, help me get it. And they work through things like interlibrary loan.
mm.
And if you really want to do something, you'll go to any lengths to do it. And that's what I do, and that's why the research is thorough. Thank you for noticing, by the way.
No problem. Okay, so let's get into it. So my first question to you is, how did Islam come to America? Because I guess some people have the perception that it kind of came over with with the Africans doing the slave trade. But from your research, what's the earliest contact of Muslims being in America?
Well, this is a topic of debate because people say they are convinced by such and such evidence of supposed Arabic inscriptions on old coins or on markers for the deceased. Um, However, that there is no consensus, scholarly consensus on these things, and I tend to resist saying that there is good evidence for pre-Columbian Muslim presence in the United States. I don't say that it is impossible to have occurred. In fact, I think it's likely that there were explorers from the Mediterranean, from the western coast of Africa, who were Muslim and made it to the Americas. But in terms of persuasive evidence, I haven't seen anything that has made me say with confidence that pre-Columbian contact was definitely made. So I would say the earliest records of Muslims in the United States that I have seen, I'm familiar with, are of the enslaved Africans and some traders who have come to the United States, and that uh, I believe the earliest evidence that I've seen is maybe the late 1600s of
Mhm.
enslaved Africans, and definitely the early 1700s.
Yeah. So with those enslaved Africans, is there any evidence of them like spreading Islam, like after they stopped being slaves, or was it something that was just kind of handed down incognito?
Well, there is some evidence,
Mhm.
not a lot of spreading, but let's talk about a couple different elements of that. So
Okay.
first of all, in terms of like pure conversion,
Mhm.
we the evidence, the strongest evidence, and for anyone familiar with the history of Muslim enslaved Muslims in the Americas, in the United States, we know that it's the Georgia Sea Islands off the Georgia coast, South Carolina coast, um, where there was the largest known concentration of Muslims, and the most famous Muslim there, Bilali, was a respected
Mhm.
enslaved person there, and it is it seems that some of the members of his family that married into his family uh, embraced Islam under his influence. So as
Mm,
a convert, there you go. That's how conversion occurs. That's the most simple kind, but the clearest kind. So we have evidence of that. But in terms of talking about, well, how is it passed on to other people? Well, maybe some people taught it to their children and they told them to hide that evidence. There are people who've claimed that to this day that they have maintained a lineage from of secret um, Islamic identity since enslaved days through their family. Um, I don't know if that evidence is particularly persuasive, but there are people who claim that. And then, in addition, their scholarship discusses the passing on of Islamic teachings, Islamic um, like amulets and talismans that
mm,
maybe someone who comes from a different region is not Muslim, but they're enslaved together. Someone um, maybe they're from the similar part of Africa. They're both from Senegal, for instance, but one is Muslim and one is not. But they may share common um, popular religious culture, and the trading of amulets and the trading of just folk knowledge. Maybe a Muslim might tell them a story from the Quran or something like that, and that can get interspersed into a broader folk knowledge, a religious folk knowledge. And keep in mind too that this did not only happen, presumably, between two enslaved people. This could sometimes happen with slaveholders and their families. So
mm,
there is a story, it's in the novel, written by abolitionists, a white abolitionist, about an enslaved Muslim who was a spiritualist who could see, who claimed to see the spirits of the deceased. And that the children of the slaveholder were impacted by this and became convinced and actually learned some potentially learn some Arabic from this person. But we can't discount that there was multiple exchanges going on. So maybe not outright conversions, but
mm.
certainly religious exchanges are probably happening on a much broader level than can be documented as of right now.
All right. So next question. So fast forward a little bit from the slave eras. When did Islam like come out in the like openly? Because I understand like Thomas Jefferson had a copy of a Quran.
Mhm.
So what was like the first openly Islamic movement in America?
Well, let's see. It depends on how you talk about that. Openly Islamic movement in America. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, as we all know, late 1700s. And then there are reports that there are converts, sailors American sailors who are on ships in the Mediterranean who convert to Islam, and the reports that get back to the United States about it. Then we don't really hear much. Maybe occasionally we hear of an American that moved to Morocco that embraced Islam, maybe to marry a woman out in Morocco or something like that. But then we have the beginnings of what lead to the Islamic movements. We have in the 1870s, early 1870s, and really 1860s, individual who was mixed African and white named Pascal Beverly Randolph, who led, um, he was a spiritualist and claimed to channel the Prophet Muhammad. And at one point, he claimed that he had gained esoteric Islamic knowledge from the Middle East and brought it back and was teaching it. And he called it Rosicrucian knowledge. If you know about the
Mm,
esoteric movements,
okay.
Rosicrucians go back a long ways. Who knows if he had any kind of contact with the actual Rosicrucians, but he certainly called it that. And part of the reason is because Rosicrucians claimed to get their knowledge from Muslims back
Mm,
in the medieval days. Anyway, he claimed he had a esoteric group um, called the Ansara, and that was the name of an esoteric Muslim group in the Middle East. And he claimed to be initiating people in this in the 1860s, 1870s. And from that, we start to see different esoteric groups kind of claiming connection. And eventually, esoteric groups related to this greater lineage of esotericism start developing what people know is famous today. The Theosophical Society forms in 1875, and a man named Alexander Muhammad Webb, who is white American, liberal white American, joins the Theosophical Society in St. Louis. And in St. Louis, there happened to be a lot of interest in the Paschal Beverly Randolph, and in 1886 in 1887, they start talking about being involved with Islamic mysticism, Sufism, that's what we call it. And there was a Sufi group that was started um, in St. Louis and with other people that were connected to this esoteric movement. And Alexander Russell Webb then goes off and gets interested in Islam, gets connected with Muslims um, in the Philippines and India and in the Middle East, and comes back to the United States and starts an open Muslim movement. So if we're looking for a true Muslim movement, there it is. But but there's so many other elements to it, and I think part of my goal today and come here is to show how it was diverse from the very beginning, because the first people that there were true converts that joined his movement, but there were also people that were interested in studying Islam, and they were the Shriners.
Mm.
And the Shriners, when they originally formed in, the documented history and all the evidence shows that they originally formed in the early 1870s, but and there's various reasons why they formed at that time. But a lot of these individuals were intellectual esotericists. They were not, sometimes we have a caricature of what the Shriners are today, that they drive the little cars, that they're nice people. They have the Shriners hospitals and they do a lot of charitable work. But at the beginning, there was more of an interest in investigating um, the culture of Islam, religion of Islam, and a lot of these early followers of Muhammad Webb's study circles, early members of his study circles, were involved with the Shriner community. And what makes that especially interesting is that we see that the Shriner community was not just the one kind that was there in New York, the main uh, white Shriners. There was other kind of Shriners and other Shriners who were following different groups, including the Black Shriner community. They were also getting interested in Islam. Now they weren't converting right away, but there was an interest in sincere appreciation of Islam, even if they were professed Christians. And we start to see uh, Muslim performers come from North Africa, where there's a long tradition of acrobatics
Mm.
being practiced among Muslims. They're coming to the United States. They're becoming Masons because they're being welcomed into these communities, and they're identifying with Islamic elements of these communities. Over in England, there's a movement among white converts out there who start identifying with different um, Masonic and other esoteric communities and connect with Muslims through Masonic channels all across the world and other esoteric channels. And by the late 1800s, by the 1890s, we see the Western, all across the world, where there are where there are French or English I'm sorry, French or English Masonic communities, we see groups of individuals interested in Islam with a sincere interest in Islam, not making fun of it, not just playing up like Muslims, but sincere interest in Islam. And they're really laying the groundwork for a lot of what would come in the 20th century.
So let me pose a quick question here. So I don't know if you ever read books like Christianity, Islam, and those type of books. And those books have a premise that the Shriners and Masons are hiding Islamic knowledge from the people, trying to trick people. So that's more mythology than reality, then you would say.
Well, I think there is, first of all, when I tried to do this research, so I want to be uh, diplomatic about this. When I tried to
Mhm,
do this research, I reached out to the Shriner headquarters. I reached
mhm,
out to their New York headquarters, and they said, "Well, we don't have any records anymore. They were all lost." Um,
mhm,
so I had to find out more evidence by going to by contacting Masonic libraries in different parts of the world, and all they had were fragments.
mhm.
So there is information that's been passed along in other channels that I would say are not as the documents are not as strong as some of the things I did look at, but that information can't be entirely discarded
Mhm.
about, what the Masons knew and what they didn't know. Um, so I would say that it is important to sometimes look at the research what's out there. I don't know if they really knew all these things that, I think a lot of the traditions are, well, the Masons and the Shriners got this true Islamic knowledge from during the Crusades and that they're hiding that. I don't think that's true. I think though that there was Islamic knowledge that individuals got, particularly from the 1870s to the 1890s, but they were not trying to hide it. I think they were just keeping it within their normal Masonic bounds. And um, what happened was in the 1890s and early 20th century, we start to see um, new competing esoteric groups, most notably the Oriental Order of the Magi, who produced these narratives about the Shriners possessing true Islamic knowledge, and they disseminated this narrative through books. And it's one of my theories that these were books that were known to the founder of the Nation of Islam, W.D. Farad, and that he advised people to read. I have reason to believe that, and part of that those books being disseminated has led to the perpetuation of these ideas that they're hiding this true Islamic knowledge.
Okay, gotcha. Right. So now, before we get into Islam and African Americans, that's going to be a huge portion of this interview. Was there ever a point in history in America where Islam was prominent among like white Americans or something like anything like that? Or was it
Prominent? No.
okay?
Was it more than like a handful of people? Well, sort of. Um, it has never, well, first of all, to put in perspective, it has never been anywhere close to as popular it has been as Islam has been for African Americans. It has never been as close as popular among white Americans, among Latinos, among Asian Americans, among anybody else. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But if that's your real question, then no, it never even came close. But there
Okay.
have certainly been communities, noteworthy communities of other ethnicities who have embraced Islam.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So now getting past Islam being passed down through the enslaved Africans, I was under understanding that the Ahmadiyas played a pretty big role. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. So the Ahmadiyas, and for those who don't know, uh, that's a movement that starts in India, in what today is Pakistan,
Mhm.
and where a man claiming to be a new prophet, Ghulam Ahmad, um, claimed to have a new revelations and directions. Now, just to add some context to that, there have been long traditions within the Muslim community because I think a real simplistic notion is um, that the Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet. Well, there have been differences of opinions in that have been passed along for hundreds of years in the Muslim community, and that tradition is what influenced the development of this individual, Ghulam Ahmad, claiming to be a prophet in India in 1880s. And part of what was behind his attempts to spread a new message of Islam was a response to colonialism in India, and the British attempts to spread Christianity and to um, convert the Indians. And so his movement was very evangelical in the sense that it was wants to spread Islam in a way as of countering what they saw as an incorrect belief of Christianity and following the British ways. And in doing this, they were very the people who began to follow Ghulam Ahmad were very energized and spread the message to the West early on in the early 20th century, and they reached the England where they began to form a community and develop press, and so they're able to write things in English and start to disseminate that. And they developed missionaries, including the missionary Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, that who came to the United States in 1920 and was incredibly successful, the most successful proselytizer of Americans to Islam um, for his up until his time. And under his leadership for the next 3 or 4 years before he left. I believe he left the United States in 1923, but then left other people in charge. During that time, I believe over 1,000 people embraced Islam, majority of which were African Americans. There were, though, whites and Latinos who also converted. And so there was nothing like that before. Alexander Wesson Webb maybe had 100 people, a couple hundred people at most, but we don't have really evidence. That's just speculation about those numbers. And then there have been more Orthodox Sunni Muslims who've attempted to convert, but they were not converting in the hundreds of people as far as the evidence shows, before 1920, before 1923, the way Mufti Muhammad Sadiq did. And so most everything in terms of most of the movements started gaining momentum under the Ahmadiyya's work there in the early 1920s. So there have been a lot of different individuals who tried to convert people here and there, and including individuals probably who went on to become highly influential, more influential than Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. But his the movement he starts in the United States is really the first um, major growth of conversions. So yes, undeniable that they are played a major role in the development of Islam in America.
Now, did Sheikh Dawood, where did he fit in the scheme of things? Did he study under Mufti Muhammad or he came later?
Sheikh Dawood Ahmad Faisal, who was known throughout the 20th century as the leader of the State Street Mosque in Brooklyn, also
Okay.
known as the Islamic Mission of America. Now, we don't know his exact beginnings. We do know that he is an immigrant from Grenada in the Caribbean, and
Mm.
that he came in the year 1913. Um, I can't recall exactly when he was born, but I think he was 21 years old in 1913. He immigrated. He was a skilled violinist, and he started a concert bureau in Brooklyn, or I believe maybe in Harlem first, and eventually moved to Brooklyn. But there's scattered evidence that he was working with a Sudanese
Mm.
Orthodox teacher, Muslim teacher, and proselytizer named Sati Majid, who had come in the very beginning of the 20th century and traveled all across the United States and set up and converted individuals and set up communities in New York, but also in New York City, but also in Buffalo, Philadelphia, I believe, oh, definitely Pittsburgh, Detroit, I believe Cleveland, and maybe a few other cities. And he was converting African Americans maybe in small numbers, not as far as the evidence shows anything like Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, but the evidence suggests that that Sheikh Dawood Faisal maybe worked with him. Now, there's some other evidence that Sheikh Dawood Faisal had contact with other immigrants, and maybe that his own father had been a Muslim, um, but in the 1930s, after Sati Majid left the United States in 1929, Sheikh Dawood um, left the music business behind and became a full-time Islamic worker. But although I believe he did have a job working for Amtrak, but he devoted his life to promoting Islam, and may have been influenced by other teachers, including a man named Muhammad Izzuddin. But uh, early on, the evidence points mostly towards Sati Majid.
Okay. All right. Now, the next person figure I want to talk about in Islam is Noble Drew Ali. Now, to my understanding, most of the modern movements from Nation of Islam onward kind of over there, I guess, leads well, I guess it kind of traced back to his teachings. So, so where does he fit in the scheme of things?
Well, if Mufti Muhammad Sadiq had the first big movement, Noble Drew Ali had, if Mufti Muhammad Sadiq had the first big growth, no,
Mm,
the prophet, the claimed prophet Noble Drew Ali had the first truly big movement
mm,
where it was beyond conversion. It was a political organization and a economic program, a social movement that transformed the lives and the way of thinking of thousands of people, literally thousands of people. And so it really shaped a lot of what came afterwards in a way that the Ahmadiyya movement didn't. The Ahmadiyya movement gave it the energy. It was like the galvanizing electric force. It latched onto Marcus Garvey's movement, and those things interconnected. And then Noble Drew Ali came in and took it all together and created. He took it all to the next level. So where does he stand in this history? It's like the next stage. I don't like to use the word stage too much, but the next major uh, um, plateau, the next major growth spurt of Islam in America.
yeah,
And I think that was mainly what you were asking about. Where does
yeah.
he stand, right?
Now, a couple of questions about him.
Hmm.
One, was his name Timothy Drew or Thomas Drew? Was he a Mason or was he a Shriner?
Well, I think the evidence is pretty strong that he had gone as Thomas Drew, Dr. Thomas Drew, that he worked as a healer in Newark, New Jersey, and New York City in the late 1910s and early 1920s under the name Dr. Thomas Drew. And furthermore, that as a child, he went by the name of Thomas. Now, that
Mm,
doesn't mean he wasn't born with the name Timothy. Uh, we don't have, excellent information about his birth or his true parents. And later followers refer to um, his pre Noble Drew Ali name as Timothy Drew, but there has long been knowledge that he may have gone by the name Thomas Drew. We have newspaper evidence of this, Ancestry.com documents and census records, etc., that say point to Thomas Drew being the name that he had used for a long part of his life before being named Noble Drew Ali. Now, the question of whether he was a Shriner, uh, I don't know if we have any kind of solid evidence of that, or a Mason. He certainly employed Masonic and Shriner like symbolism within his movement, but whether he himself was a member of those groups is not really clear. We do know that there have long been rumors that a man claiming to be from the Sudan and claiming to be a Mason and a Shriner, Dr. Abdul Hamid Suleiman, uh, had some sort of contact with Noble Drew Ali back in the early 1920s, perhaps earlier. And so it's possible that he transmitted his Masonic knowledge and Shriner knowledge to Noble Drew Ali, who may not himself have been in one of those organizations. So I think that's the state of the knowledge in the academic circles here.
Okay. Now, let me ask you kind of a speculative question. Why do you think Noble Drew Ali? Okay, let me give some context because like I used to be a Sunni Muslim. And when I heard about New Al, we looked at it, oh, this is a bastardization of Islam. He called himself a prophet. He has this other thing he's calling the Quran. Why do you think he employed Islam the way he did? Was it a lack of knowledge of real Islam, or was he trying to be practical and give people what he thought they could deal with coming from Christian backgrounds? Why do you think it came out the way it did for him, as far as his teachings?
Well, there's speculation and then there's informed speculation. I'd like to do more informed speculation.
Right.
So, what I found in my research was that a lot of his teachings and a lot of the teachings that eventually were also in the Nation of Islam, because we've already hinted at that there was some connection. A lot of those teachings go back to slave days, and they
Mm,
were not necessarily Islamic. And for instance, this idea that there was a flag that the slave traders put on the boat, on the slave ships, a red flag, and that drew people onto the slave ships. And then once they got on the slave ships, they took down the red flag, and some say they put up a skull and crossbones, or they just took it down and just kept on sailing. Um, that story seems to we have record that it was transmitted by the Moors in the Moor Science Temple of America. And they, of course, had the red flag, as far as we know, the five-pointed green star of Morocco post 1915. And but they sometimes called it the red flag. In fact, some people called the early Moorish Science Temple of America the Red Flag Temple. And
mm,
if you go through some of the teachings, especially the oral teachings that have been transmitted, but taking it from early sources, we see other elements uh, that were known to have been practiced in the folk religion. Some people
mm,
call it hoodoo, but I wouldn't even say it's hoodoo like that, casting spells or something like that. But some people might say it's the because a lot of people were professing Christians that still believed in these things. They believed that, for instance, uh, they were professing Christians in the slave days, and they said, "We are the only true Christianity." Uh, the white people that claim Christianity, they have a fake Christianity. It's not real Christianity, and our Christianity, you may call it something different, but we have the true religion. And so I think what was going on with Noble Drew Ali is that he may have been introduced to elements of Islam. And there's strong evidence, I think, that he had contact with Muslims from abroad, including Muslims from Morocco, and that would explain certain um, unusual phrases and words that are in the teachings of the Moorish Science Temple of America. But he took these elements and communicated in a way that made sense to the people of their time. And
Mm,
if you look at any successful preacher, what I don't care what religion it is, they're successful because they communicate a message in a way that resonates with people. Now, well, what Sunni Muslims develop in the 21st century, what they may call Orthodox Islam, is not necessarily the same thing that Sunni Muslims all across the world and all across the time call Orthodox Islam. These things are shaped by people's opinions, by institutions, by financials, by, you get millions of dollars coming from particular countries that shape what we understand. If I race Islam in a mosque today, there's all these forces that are shaping what I perceive are orthodox. And so we have to take that into consideration. Now, I'm a religious studies scholar. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a Muslim theologian at all. I'm not Muslim at all. And so for me to say one thing is legit, one thing is not, that's for other people to decide. But I will say that there are certain traditions that I think he was uh, drawing up and seeing Islam through that lens in order
mm,
to communicate it to the people in a way that they truly felt it. And I say this because I want to make stress this point that uh, the people that heard him, they weren't faking it. They didn't think, oh, this this guy is came up with a made up phony Islam, and I'll agree because I'll get benefits if I pretend to be Muslim too. They believed him. Why would you believe someone that's saying all this crazy stuff? You're Muslim, your ancestors are Muslim. Why would you believe it unless you knew it was true, unless you had some reason to believe it? And my my hypothesis is that he was drawing on people's memories of their ancestors and what people had taught them from the past and saying, look, you were right. And that religion that you were taught in the past, we just call that Islam. And it's this Moorish Islam. And it's something that maybe other Muslims can't claim a monopoly over. And we could kind of get into that if we were to talk about things later and where it's a little bit more clear, but I think it's easy to dismiss it. And so I want to defend it to that extent that there's a varieties of Islam in throughout the world and throughout history. And I don't want to present him as a faker,
right,
and just give respect where respect is due. That's all I got on that.
exactly. But furthermore about Noble Drew Ali, what was I understand that he established the Canaanite temple for the Moorish Science Temple. What type of teachings was that?
Well, again, we don't know all the details
Okay.
about what the Canaanite temple was. The traditions in Moorish Science Temple of America is that in 1913 in Newark, New Jersey, Noble Drew Ali started the Canaanite temple above a barber shop or near a barber shop with people, and that he wasn't necessarily preaching Islam, or some people say he was preaching Islam,
Mm,
but that and this is the teachings within the Moorish Science Temple of America after 1925, when it's a widely known movement that uh, the African Americans are descendants of the biblical Canaanites and the biblical Moabites.
mm,
And that's almost those. And by the way, that he did not invent that. Other people had been teaching that, not only in the United States, but even in North Africa, there were some
mm.
traditions about that.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. All right. Now, the next thing, well, I guess lastly, the last thing I want to talk about New World Jelly, I understand after, even during the time he was alive, the temple split, and today there's like three separate main Moorish temples. Is that accurate? And as far as you know, did they keep the same teachings? Because I'm hearing now like there's Moors claiming like surveying citizens and stuff like that. Is that like a new interpretation, or is that something that he taught as well?
Well, first of all, uh, as the published evidence reflects, the published documents of the Moorish Science Temple of America from Noble Drew Ali's days are respect the government, follow the
Mm,
government, and you are citizens of the United States.
okay.
Um, Now, as far as the development of a lot of different sects, SECTS of or factions or Moorish communities. That happened right away. Noble Drew Ali died in 1929, and
Hmm.
already there were divisions
Okay.
over who should lead it. Now, the sovereign citizens, there's multiple sources that impacted that, include from deep within early history of more science history of people who broke off more off the original teachings. Some people combined it with Nation of Islam teachings and had a complete different history of the world and said because of this history we aren't actually really citizens of the United States and therefore you don't have to pay taxes, etc. And so there's a lot of different, uh, you said three different groups,
Hmm.
maybe three different main groups, but there's probably 20 different
Oh
communities,
wow.
and there's a lot of different ones, but uh, we could go on and on, and I'm sure you want to talk about other things.
Right. Okay. All right. All right. Now the next major, okay, Wallace Fard Muhammad, W.D. Muhammad, uh, Ford Muhammad. Okay, now, let's talk about this individual. Now, who was he, and what was his role in Islam in
Who
America?
was he? Man, that is a big question. People are debating this all the time, and what I think we could say is that he was a highly intelligent individual who probably came from South Asia or perhaps Iran, um, but incorporated a lot of different teachings. Nation of Islam claims that he was born on February 26, 1877, and then came to Detroit in July 4th, 1930, Independence Day, and taught the African American people there the knowledge of themselves and that they were Asiatic people who come from the tribe of Shabazz, and that discovering that knowledge, they can lead successful lives and resist the debilitating temptations of white society that were holding them and preventing them from living up to their godly nature. Now, who he was, that's a deep question. Was he the individual who was incarcerated in San Quentin prison in the early 1920s? In my opinion, I think the academic consensus is leaning more and more that way, is that, yeah, probably he was the individual in San Quentin prison. Um, Michael Muhammad Knight's new book about the supreme wisdom lessons uh, shows, in my opinion, highly persuasively that a lot of the lessons were based on um, materials that were uniquely or near uniquely available to prisoners in San Quentin prison in the 1920s. And there was even contact with the University of California. So Farad had claimed that he had attended University of California, and there's some evidence to kind of back that up. And now where he was before then, well, the evidence points to that he had immigrated to the West Coast and was working maybe up in Oregon and Washington, maybe even Montana, living with other immigrants from South Asia, working as a vendor of tamales on the street, which was a thing for recent immigrants at that time, and before moving to Los Angeles and getting involved in the distribution of heroin, which eventually landed him in San Quentin prison. But prior to all that, we don't know when he arrived necessarily. Um, but to me, the words, particular words in his teaching, especially the word Shabazz, suggests strongly that he came from a South Asian background. Whether or not he himself was from there or whether he was highly influenced by people from there, including perhaps his parents, that's something we still haven't settled on, and people are still debating about this in new literature, new articles, and I think the debate will continue for a long time.
Now, two questions. Was he, does the evidence show that he was ever a member affiliated with the Moorish Science Temple? And is there any evidence to support the theory that he was part of like a communist plot to disrupt or anything like that? Influence the African Americans against the United States government?
The evidence that he was in the Moorish Science Temple of America is very weak. It's based, what I've seen is based on two things. Really weak photographic evidence. Oh, this person in this sort of vague picture kind of looks like him, so that must be him. No, I'm not convinced by that at all. Then there, supposed claims that he's on documents. Some people say that he had used the name David Ford Ill or gone as other names. I'm not convinced by that evidence either. So what people consider evidence is not particularly persuasive to me on that. On the other front, I don't even consider that stuff evidence. That's just rumor because I have never seen anything even beginning to be persuasive, like some sort of secret government document that reveals that yes, he indeed was sent by another government. I I am not familiar with anything that is even approaching something I would consider evidence along those lines.
Hmm, okay. And now, at one time, did the Nation of Islam use the Moorish Quran in their early teachings?
Well, I think they did. But that's a debate um, between scholars right now, and of course, anyone is, other people are debating that as well. But there were there was a series of expose essays that came out in a Chicago newspaper, the Chicago Herald American, that came out in the 1940s when the FBI raided the Chicago Temple of the Nation of Islam. And the FBI reports, or most of the FBI reports, are widely available online. But the Chicago Herald American stories are not included in those. And there are other records about the 1940s and 1930s Nation of Islam and Moorish Science Temple that have not been made available, not only from FBI files but also from Works Progress Administration. And anyway, these newspaper articles say, look, we're in the temple with Elijah Muhammad. They name him by name, and or they call him Muk Muk, but he was known to use that name, Muk Muk, or other names that are reflective of Elijah Muhammad and Farad. And there's no doubt they were in the temple. Now, had they confused, and they claimed that the Nation of Islam was, they give quotes, excerpts from the teachings and from the writings that were distributed there, supposedly. And these, we know, are quotes from the Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple of America, except in those newspaper articles, they do not identify the title of the work as the Holy Quran and Moorish Science Temple of America, which leads me to think that it's possible that the Nation of Islam was using the Holy Quran, but maybe giving it a different title. Now, the weird thing about these articles is they never talk about Farad's teachings, which seems suspicious if those are so important. But my theory is that perhaps in order to um, entice Moorish Americans into the Nation of Islam. Sometimes it probably happened in Detroit, and I'm thinking it happened in Chicago. There was an emphasis played on the connections of the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, and emphasizing that this was a continuation of Noble Drew Ali's teachings. And but there are some people who don't buy it, and so I can't say that for sure, and we'll leave that up to other people to find more evidence on.
Okay. And in talking about whatever became of Farad Muhammad, now Warith Deen Muhammad, who was previously Wallace Muhammad, he made claims that he talks to him every day, and he even introduced him. He called the guy, I think, Wali Muhammad. What's your theory on who that guy was? Do you think he was Farad Muhammad, or you think he was just somebody else?
Muhammad Abdullah is
Yeah.
probably who you're thinking of.
Hmm.
Uh, and no, and they called him Professor Muhammad Abdullah because he was very highly educated. No, I don't think he was Farah Muhammad. I think that was a way tool used as a means to put that question to rest.
Mm,
But who he was a member of. No, you have the Ahmadiyya, but the Ahmadiyya are into two sects, divided into two sects. The major sect is um, known colloquially as the Qadiani movement, but a
mm,
smaller sect is known colloquially as the Lahori movement because its um, original headquarters was Lahore in Pakistan. Now, he was part of the Lahori movement and he had known Elijah Muhammad in the 1950s and he had been connected with a lot of different Muslims. He had probably learned about Farad Muhammad and um, different elements of his teachings from other followers all across the country because he was connected in California and Philadelphia and he was very informed and very knowledgeable. So I don't doubt that he could speak on things that Farad Muhammad had knowledge on, but I don't think they are identical at all.
okay. And and the last thing, if you had to take your best informed guess, what would you say, what do you theorize happened to Farad Muhammad?
I theorize that he left the country,
Mhm.
but that's a hard one. I just don't know.
Okay. All right. Now, before we get to the last person I want to speak on, I want to just talk a little bit about Clarence 13X Williams, Five Percenters, Nation of Gods and Earth. Where do they fit into the scheme of things?
So they developed out of a few different communities of young people and people who were not satisfied with the restrictions of the Nation of Islam in New York and were getting additional teachings, hearing additional teachings, and interpreting the teachings of the Nation of Islam because they heard the core teaching that you are gods. And if I'm a god, then I can interpret things and do things the way I want. If that is literally true, then that
Mm,
it gives me that power to do that. You have different groups of young people who are not in the Nation of Islam who are hearing this message and teaching each other, and they start exchanging the lessons with each other and developing their own lessons and doing research on from other Muslims and ex-Muslims and Muslims who don't are no longer in the temple, uh,
mm.
and they're learning from each other and they start spreading the knowledge and sharing this knowledge outside of the temple, and it's a informal community of the nation's teachings. So that's
Okay.
where they fit in. In the mid 1960s, they develop. Of course, they get well known in the 1980s through the hip hop music scene.
Mhm. And I read something. I can't remember where I read this, but have you ever come across that they were backed unknowingly by the CIA that that Clarence Williams had like applied for a grant or something from a foundation. The foundation was just like a front for the CIA. That's how they were able to collect, who the members were and stuff like that. Have you ever heard anything like that? I can't
Uh,
remember where I read that.
no, I don't recall hearing that it was backed by the CIA. I think it was someone from New York State. I'd have to dig back into the literature on it, but I thought it was someone from New York State. And if they had backing from CIA, um, I just don't know about it.
Okay. All right. Now the last person I want to talk about is the Aaron Sewell community, Dr. York, Malachi York. And I have to give a disclaimer to my audience. Now, audience, up until this point, everybody we spoke of, I have had the utmost respect and admiration for. Even though they weren't the type of Muslim that I was, I still respect what these people did and believe that they were sincere and true in what they're doing. But this last gentleman, I don't like, and I know that's outside of journalistic integrity to put your own opinions in this, but I have issues with this guy. So I'm going to try to be as professional as possible and put my personal beliefs aside. But I just want to give that disclaimer. If you see my tone changes from what I was speaking to the other gentleman, this is why. Okay, so let's get back to Dr. York. Now, who is this gentleman?
Okay. He is a individual who originally claimed to have been a member of Sheikh Dawood's
Mm,
Islamic Mission of America State Street Mosque in Brooklyn, that he may have joined it as early as 1957, but he certainly was in there by 1963 when he was 18 years old. There's decent evidence that points to this.
mm,
Now, he has also claimed that he is the descendant of the Sudanese Mahdi from the Sudanese claimed Messiah from the 19th century who led a rebellion against imperialist forces. Um, but in the mid 1960s, after going to jail, at first he was in State Street Mosque, then he went to jail and met other people, Muslims, and people from different African religious groups. And after being released, he starts his own movement. I think it was initially called Ansar Pure Sufi, and there's a theory that he even had been influenced by Muslim mystics and other Muslim immigrants, and combined everything into one. And I can't remember the name changes immediately, but I think 1967 he starts as Ansar Pure Sufi. I think he went by Nubian Islamic Hebrews by
mm,
1969. I think he went to Ansaru Allah community by 1970s, in the early 1970s. And each time there's a shift in emphasizing Islam, emphasizing Israelite identity, emphasizing African identity. Um, and he emphasizes African identity through the 1970s and 19, I'm sorry, Islamic identity through the 1970s and 80s. And during that time, the movement becomes very well known. It starts spreading first to Philadelphia and I believe out to Ohio and to Florida and Georgia. And there are thousands of people by the 1980s all across the United States living in communes, and most of the individuals there will make their living by selling products, herbs and fragrances and pamphlets that the group has written on the streets. And they live a very isolated community. And in the early 1990s or maybe late 1980s, he stops claiming to be Muslim. Um, they're Moors. He says we're Nubian Moors, we're African, e Kemetic, in other words,
mm.
Egyptian religious Moors, but we're not Muslim. And there's different reasons for that, and he identifies the community as being connected with the indigenous Americans in the United States. But um, there are reasons why people don't have strong feelings about him. In 2004, he was arrested for, among other charges, child molestation, and there's been many accusations of abuse in the community. So um, that's his history and how he fits in. He left the Nation of Islam, or I'm sorry, he left the State Street Mosque really early, within a few years, and was off doing his own thing and blending everybody else's teachings, including Moorish Science Temple and Nation of Islam.
Yeah. So was he actually related to the Mahdi family of Sudan? Any evidence of that?
I don't think the evidence is very strong.
Okay. And what do you think the appeal? Because like I said, his movement was strong. I mean, I have to admit, I read a lot of his books, and it was some appeal to him until you start reading. It's like every book contradicts the next book. But do you think it was just because at the time Islam was kind of popular, like I said, with the 5%ers, rappers, it was a new resurgence of the Nation of Islam. So was he just kind of riding that tidal wave at the time?
Well, he was definitely a participant in the tidal wave. He was giving it some of its energy.
Okay.
Um, you know, when especially if you're in these big cities, and from testimonies I've seen, is that most of the people, by the way, who joined that movement never had been Muslim before. These
Mm,
were people who were completely, frequently they had a lot of personal problems, and they're seeking out something that was black, that they felt they could relate to, but also appeal to their curiosity, all the different things that they've heard. Well, I've heard that we're Nation of Islam. I heard that, we're Tribe of Sabaz. I heard that we're from Africa, that maybe there's connections with immigrants from Africa or enslaved from Africa. Or I've heard these different things, these different teachings. And if you're in a major city, Chicago, I think most of the major cities, probably Los Angeles, they probably even made it out to. But you've heard all these things because that's in the social world. It's in the ether at that time. And so he puts it all together like nobody else does. He takes each story that you've heard and says, "Oh yeah, they're part of us too." And so unlike other people, he has a powerful storytelling appeal, and someone can find themselves within his stories, no matter who they are, if they're someone who's seeking and has a lot of curiosity about these different things that they've heard in the culture.
Okay. Wow. All right. Well, I guess as we close out, is there anything you want to leave the people with about Islam, about your research, or anything at all?
I think that when I started this, there had been a lull in the research for a few years.
Mhm.
And I was so energized. And I point this out, I always point this out to people. I was not trying to research the history of African American Islam. I was trying to research the history of white and Latino Muslims.
Mhm.
And all the traces I found, they said, go back and look at the history, and maybe you'll see evidence in the history of Black Muslim communities. And so I found all this stuff while trying to do a different project.
Mhm.
And I'm still working on that original project that I want to do.
Okay.
But when I start putting this out, other people would contact me and say, "Oh, I'm inspired by your research," and they start putting stuff out. And if the more people get involved with it, the more we'll learn. And so I encourage other people to do research for themselves and participate and get in the disciplined, rigorous study of religious studies. And by other people's input and your unique insights, I think we'll develop further along and discover new things.
Okay. Excellent. Now, before we close out, this just I forgot to ask you about this person. And I'm gonna ask you about him because he's just personal to my research and the history of the numbers is Sufi Hamid, who is married to Madam Queen. He called himself a Sufi, which is a mystical order of Islam. Where do you think he got his Islam from? Was he connected to any other movement, Sheikh Dawood or Orthodox Islam? Where did he come from? Then we'll
Well,
close
this
out after that. I'm sorry, I just forgot
No,
about
no problem at all. There's a rumor he came from Chicago
it.
and was possibly because he got famous in New York. A rumor he came from Chicago and was possibly connected with Israelite communities and things like this, um, and Garveyite communities. And if you're in those communities in the 1920s and 1930s, who knows what you got connected to? Because there were
Okay.
Muslims popping up in different communities, but as far as I know, I think he invented it because at one
Mm.
point he claimed to have a book, the Omar Khayyam book, who's sort of identified with Muslim mysticism, like a famous ancient Muslim mysticism. So my suspicion is that he invented it himself in order to appeal to other people, but I don't know, and hopefully other people will find out through their own research.
Okay. All right. So lastly, do you have like a website or anywhere like if people want to, read your books or any of your articles you've written? Is there any place that people can like look you up and get some of your teachings, your I guess your research and stuff like that?
A lot of my articles are available on academia.edu. Again, I go by the name Patrick D. Bowen.
Mhm.
And my books, if you have $200, extra $200 or $300, you can buy them. But I recommend asking your librarian to see if they could get a copy. And that's the best way to get those.
All right. Well, this has been well again, I thank you for taking your time out your busy day to come on my platform. This has been so informative. I mean, I could literally go on for hours. I was trying to condense this into an hour, but I've learned so much. And I'm someone who's been studying for years, and I still learned a lot. So I know my audience was in for a big treat today. So thank you so much, Dr. Bourne, for coming in. And lastly, is there anything you're working on that people should be on the lookout for? I know you mentioned the third edition of your book is due to come out. Any other projects coming down the pipe or anything like that?
You know, I'm trying to broaden my horizons and talk about the state of religion in 2024. And so, you know, I'll be coming out with stuff like that here in the future. But that's all. That's all.
Okay.
Thank you so much, by the way, for the invitation to do that. I do appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay, there you have it, YouTube. This has been another edition of PNG News Investigates. Until I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Until next time, take care.